It's not like a cold case where it's been and gone and you can spend all the time, well, you can't spend all the time and resources in the world, but the time you invest, the kind of slow thinking approach and the care is very different to a homicide happened 4 hours ago and the evidence is disappearing fast, the criminal's still out there, the media are all over you, senior managers are all over you, the public has an expectation, we need to get a grip of this quick.
Welcome, everybody, back to the pod. Thank you for listening. We're getting to the back end of the season now, and we're starting to think about season 2. We'd really like to hear your thoughts about what you'd like to hear. If you can visit the website, thecollators.com. You can email us at shout@thecollators.com. I can't stress this enough. We really want to hear everything that you have to say, good or bad, and any ideas we would really welcome. Thanks for your support so far. We're a little bit taken aback, to be honest, but we really appreciate it. So the topic for today is prediction and why it's difficult. In my career as an analyst and as an intel officer, prediction is perhaps the most sought after ability, but it's the one that's the hardest to do because it's very difficult to predict when and where and how things will happen. And I'm going to start the show off by going straight to Howard and saying, Howard, start us off. Why is prediction so difficult?
We do in these podcasts take the biggest subjects and then pick the hardest aspect of them. I agree with you. Prediction is a whole different level of difficult over the things we've talked about so far: information, intelligence, analysis, and decision making. First things first, what do we mean by prediction? All we mean in simple terms is presenting information about an event in the future rather than an event in the past or things that are going on currently. So it's this prediction of something in the future, hence the phrase. And we can all think of Nostradamus and the various publications. Predictions, something that, like you say, people want throughout life, not just in law enforcement, but because they want to know what's in the future so they can be aware of it and plan for it, maybe to avoid something or take an advantage of something. I wish I could predict next week's lottery numbers because then I'd be potentially a millionaire. I wish I could predict the date of my death, or my insurance companies do, because then actuarially they could work out when to stop insuring me so they don't have to pay out to my good lady and save having to beat me to death with an ice pick. The first thing I'd say is you need to make a distinction, because we're talking about prediction here versus non-predictive analysis, i.e. non-future. There's a distinction between prediction and certainty, and you mentioned certainty. Prediction, what do you think will happen in the future? Certainty, by contrast, how confident are you in your analytic product? How correct do you think it might be? That's something we've already dealt with in other podcasts, but they are two different things. When you are predicting the future, there's a level of confidence in that prediction, just as when you're creating a piece of analysis right now based on current and or historic information. But they are two different scalars that you would need to measure. So if I said, I think next week an asteroid is going to hit the Earth, if that was my prediction, next Friday, part of that question should be, okay, if that's your prediction, how confident are you that your prediction is correct? And I say, well, I've virtually no confidence because I'm basing it on no information. It's a blind guess, not just a best guess. Why do I think that's important? We've already highlighted in previous episodes that ultimately all intelligence products and processes are a best guess. The product we turn up is a best guess. In other words, they're extrapolating from data and information from multiple sources, differing or unknown quality and quantity. How relevant are they to the issue in question? All that kind of stuff. And no matter how good the processing is that we go through to generate that product, it's never a guarantee of correctness. You could have the best methodology, but it will always be limited by the type and form and quantity and quality of the data that informs that analytic process. Now, in those situations, I'd argue you're working with known historic data issues, because current data is historic data. Even though you're collecting it right now, it's about events in the past. Even if it's only a microsecond between your eyes registering it and your brain processing it, there is a time delay. That being the case, in that kind of analysis, the better and more relevant your data is to the issue that you're trying to explore, the more that good analysis of that data should to better products. You might even say, and this is me being really contradictory, you're predicting current rightness. So you are predicting something, but you're predicting that your assessment is correct. It's this idea of confidence. And I shouldn't really merge the terms, but I am just to have a bit of fun. Are you with me so far?
I am. Let me just come in a little second, because so when I first joined in a role where prediction was one of the expected things, right, in Intel capacity, I'll be honest, I was out of my depth. At uni, I did information science, never really dealt with prediction before, and I was kind of like a blank slate when it came to predictive techniques. And I kind of panicked a little bit because I kind of thought, right, I had this kind of mental model in my head that these senior officers and senior Intel officers and analysts would have this kind of secret sauce, this magic about how they would predict stuff. And then, but that was very early on. I'm literally talking the first few weeks and months while I'm into role. So I desperately tried to, without asking anybody at work, because that's the other thing, right? Sometimes you're in a new job. The last thing you should talk to your peers and colleagues about how you improve in role, but you don't want to show yourself up, do you? It's human nature to kind of, well, back then I was irresponsible and I thought, no, I'm going to solve this problem on my own, and struggled. So I set myself the task of, how do people predict? And pretty much I found two main ways. The first way, I think, is stats. People use the past to predict the future. Basically, they look at observations and say, from these observations, can we mathematically say something is going to happen? The second main way is essentially that kind of mental alchemy, that inference development, that almost that kind of, I think it's going to happen this Friday because of reasons 1, 2, 3, or in formal language, I infer something's going to happen this Friday because of premise 1, 2, 3. But here's the problem I had, right? And this is why it kind of failed in the police context, is why I struggled a lot. When you're trying to predict crime, I've been this. I've been a volume crime analyst, been asked to predict house burglaries, car theft, even assault. So you get to work and they say, okay, look at this is now Monday. Look at yesterday's data, last week's data. Who's going to get burgled? Who's going to get attacked? Which cars are going to get stolen? So you look at that data. But first off, you think, well, the first big problem is all the victims of crime last week, pretty unlikely they're going to be victims of crime the following week. Happens, but rare. Second problem, I don't know if all these observations are relating to the same person. So there are many criminals out there. So you don't know from your sample, if you try and do it mathematically, when you've got all the crime that's going to happen, you don't know if you're dealing with 10 criminals, 100, 1, no idea. Third problem, world changes. The doors that were left open last week and the doors that are going to be left open next week. So there's all the stat size has got problems. Then we get through to the logic bit. Then we get through to the kind of mental model, making a prediction using logic. Well, again, essentially you can say very general things. I think these are our top 3 burglars in this town, and we didn't arrest them for burglary last week, so I think they're going to be out there this week. But as for when or for where, it's tough. I mean, you can do things. You can look at their prior record, but people change their behaviour when they get locked up. People change their behaviour because the weather's bad. People change the weather. So what I'm driving at, Howard, is that I think the barrier, and I think it's not just in the police context, right? It's across the board. I see this in every walk of life. We lean into the stats or we lean into the professional judgment, but truth be told, neither approach is perfect. And I think in any sector, it's pretty evident that prediction is pretty impossible, to be frank, to rely on.
I agree with what you're saying, and there's maybe some perspectives that I use that might help get your head around that. Unlike analysing current and historic data to deal with things as this is what I think is happening right now or happened last week, with prediction, as well as all the factors that I talked about a few minutes ago about quality or certainty of our products, the moment you venture into what I'm going to call predictive analytics, you introduce a raft of factors and variables over which you have certainly no control or almost no control, but you may not even have awareness that they exist. So that's why it's not only hard, the same as any other kind of analysis, but multiple times harder than non-predictive analysis. In normal analysis of current or historic events, I would argue you have a better idea of what the whole arena of data is. Either you know it or you know you don't know it, because it already exists. But in predictive analysis, there could be a whole new data set or a whole new sequence of events in the future that you couldn't, as part of your predictive analysis, predict. And they could blow your analysis out of the water. One of the ways I think about that, have you ever watched these films where you see the pirate walking the plank? The pirate's got people walking the plank. I like planks because they're a good measure of the moments of force kind of model in physics. So the person takes one or two steps and away from the focal point, the deck, and the plank starts to bend a bit. And after that, for every step, although the steps might be the same length, the plank bends a lot more. It's not a linear scale. And ultimately it breaks. So the further we predict into the future, or the more focused our prediction, the more likely the plank is to bend a lot further than we expected. It's not a linear prediction. There's no such thing as linear data, despite what statistics will tell you, and we'll come to that later on, hopefully. I don't want to get into the methodology too much just yet. Come back to one of our great people that we discuss quite a lot, you and I, Donald Rumsfeld. We had the old known knowns, we know what we know. Known unknowns, we know don't know something, so that the task is to go out and collect what we don't know. There's a data collection exercise there. And there's the unknown knowns. We don't know that there's some stuff, but if we did know about it, we could know it. And that's where Rumsfeld finished. Now, you introduced me to a guy who is one of my all-time heroes, Slavoj Žižek, this Slovenian philosopher, thinker. And what Žižek said, lucky, but people can Google him. The guy's got a legacy. He's alive now, he's not dead. That's all over the internet. Very well presented, both in his texts. He does loads of TED Talks and podcasts. He's very entertaining to watch. One of the things he said was, well, that model is all very well, but the one that we're missing are the unknown unknowns. We don't even know that we don't know it. Now, that for me is really important, because when we're talking about prediction in the future, it's the unknown unknown that's really going to catch us out exponentially more than anything else. Give you an example. Linear trends. You've got an object in space. We throw a stone and we throw it hard enough so that it gets out of the Earth's gravity field and it's travelling at a speed in a straight line. Now, the physics of the universe are that thing, there's nothing to slow it down, although there is a tiny bit of space dust, but there's nothing really to slow it down, so it has a lot of inertia. It will keep going at that speed for a long time, and I mean thousands, millions of years, not just a few seconds. Secondly, it won't change direction because there's no force pulling on it until it enters a gravitational field of something else, like a planet or a sun. That's what you might call a linear trend. And you could predict that with great certainty. However, what you can't predict is if the thing flies into some other object in space. It physically flies into it and is destroyed, or bounces off and goes into a complete direct. Despite the accuracy of your prediction, you couldn't deal with the unknown unknown. And that for me is the Achilles heel of every single prediction. So the other point I would make is the data that you collect to do analysis right now on historic and current events may be really good for that. And we always talk about collecting the right data and processing it in the right way to create good products, relevant products for the issue we're looking at. Even though that data might be the best for historic and current analysis, it may be the wrong data to use for predicting the future. The problem is, we as human beings, never mind as intelligence operatives, data scientists, decision makers, tend to be lazy. We tend to get familiar with certain types of data, and therefore we try and use the data that, imagine it's a ball of clay. We use the same type and ball of clay to make a bowl, because we always make bowls and it works very well. But when we try and make a narrow-stemmed goblet, something different from the same clay, it always breaks because the physics are all wrong. I don't know. I'm just making something up here. And I'll give you a really good example in crime data. And it's something I've taught for years. You talked about predicting crime. Law enforcement loves something called a hotspot. Right. You have a concentration of crime in geography or type, burglary dwelling, theft of DVDs, rape, in a certain geographical area or in a certain time period. And they call those hotspots. That's all it means. And this happens not just in law enforcement, but law enforcement is the example I'm using. You'll find a lot of law enforcement will spend lots of time saying, right, that hotspot is what we're going to use to inform our future planning for crime. Now, if you think about a hotspot, all it means is lots of people in that area or in that grouping suffered a similar or the same type of crime, maybe what kind of thing was stolen, how the method of the crime took place, or just the fact that it's in that location or a similar time. But at the same time, you mentioned, Mark, that lots of other factors can affect whether that crime carries on that trend in the future. If that area's been blitzed, say they're stealing rare antiques, and there's a hotspot of rare antique thefts, they'd reach a point in that area where there's no antiques left to steal. So they would have to change. So the antique theft in that area will go down merely as a factor that's not reflected in the data. Oh, and you think, our methodology of crime intervention must be successful here. No, they've just run out of stuff to steal. You can't commit crime in a certain way if the opportunity is not going to lead to the outcome you want. So I've always been really interested in the other data, the data of where crime isn't committed, and I call them cold spots. Because for every hotspot, there are areas in time or methodology or location where no crime is committed. And I guarantee you, they're always a lot bigger than the hotspots. The hotspots are crimes that we know about that were reported. If people don't report a crime, it doesn't appear in your data set. So it's limited and flawed, therefore. It's incomplete. But cold spot data, areas where there's no crime, you don't need people to report it. It's a negative report that's the actual data. Nobody came to my house and stole my antiques. Nobody attempted to assault me and rob me of my mobile phone when I was walking down the street. And that forces you to look at different data sets to understand the mental choice. Why are criminals not committing crime in those areas? I'd suggest if you use cold spot data, it might be a better predictor of crime going forwards into the future, because the reasons for hotspot areas to decline in crime, all the choice factors that go on, are far less statistically. We've also got a bigger volume of data than in a cold spot area. Does that make sense?
It does. I want to pick up on a couple of things you said. And I want to clear up something that I've said before. I'm not saying prediction is impossible. There are circumstances. I think it was Neptune that was discovered by prediction. Essentially, it was mathematical in nature. It was, if the maths added up correctly, there should be a planet there. Look at that time. Yes, there was a planet there. We discovered Neptune. That's cool. Absolutely, prediction can be used. But I like your example about the plank, and the further you go, the more it kind of wobbles, because that's what I'm getting at. Some of the shouts that we really want are really far along that plank. And I think with crime data, but not just crime data, one of my bugbears is I have seen over several decades the same methods presented as new technique, and hotspots is one of them. Okay, I am sick of seeing hotspot maps of areas where they say, look, we've done analysis of this data and here's this hotspot map. And essentially what the map is telling you is, hey, did you know that a bunch of people live, work, and move here? Because essentially, when you go back to your negative data, positive data part, I agree with that method, and I've used your method in a real life context, because the thing about places is that places change. When I say over time, I don't mean they do change over a long, long period of time, but they change throughout the day. If I walk into town, Leeds is my nearest city. If I walk through Leeds city centre at 9 a.m., there's going to be a certain type of crew on the streets walking around, and I'm going to see there'll be a certain amount of people. The type of people I will see at 11 p.m. are very different. The types of behaviour I'm going to see are very different. It's the same place. It's the same street. It's the same thing. So to me, the negative data that you talk about, when I've used that practically in the past, that's when, okay, yes, the hotspot's telling me that the high street is a bad place, or that this particular residential street's a bad place. But it's when I can find a similar street that has the same number of people living in it, with the same amount of human activity, but doesn't have that level of crime, that's when that negative data really comes in powerful, because you say, okay, what is it? And I think it's also, I'll be honest, when I was first started, back in the early days of when I worked in Bradford, didn't know the city that well, and I would literally get on buses and occasionally go for walks around different bits just to get a sense of, because when you're looking at a two-dimensional top-down diagram or map with some heat spots, all you see is kind of strange lines and words, right? You just see kind of these place names and these area names that you've never really heard before. There might be grids or sectors or villages or towns or whatever. But you don't really get the sense of what they are because they're just abstract, right? You need to actually kind of walk down these streets. I mean, there wasn't Street View when I first started, but now I guess you could just do it from your desktop and use Google Street View and walk through and give you a sense of it. But I think it's important and I know I'm getting a little bit further away from prediction, but what I'm trying to say is that the reason why it's difficult is there are so many variables. That plank is so long, you're so far along that whether it be, and you've seen this all the time, right? If anybody follows this stuff, you will find in your inbox every 6 months, police use software to predict crime. And there's usually, there might be, if they've managed to get the rights, the shot of Minority Report or whatever, and it's the same thing year after year, decade after decade. We're going to use stats. I mean, in the 90s, it was, what was it called then? Data mining. Then it was big data.
Big data.
Now it's data science and whatever it's going to be. And and that's not to say there's not merit there. There is merit in some of this stuff, but it's oversold, I think. And the reason why I'm saying the prediction is hard is because it's hard to identify all those variables where you need to, but I think this way your plank and negative data comes in handy because it helps to know how big is a shout you are making me to ask.
You're absolutely bang on. And this is what that opens up for me as a sort of generic learning point is the further ahead in time you go, the further away you are from the data that you know right now. So the risk goes up exponentially. The more focused your prediction, the less statistically likely it is. So predictive analysis in statistical terms works best on volume data. Good example, the health service. We use predictive models on data of thousands and hundred thousands of patients to figure out that the likelihood is there's a trend in an increase in heart disease or some other feature based on a factor in the environment. Good example, the theory that sugar, the increase of sugar in diets leads to obesity, diabetes, and all the other knock-on health effects. Solution, we'll introduce a tax on sugar. So if you buy a drink that's full of sugar, you pay a tax, where if you buy the drink that's full of fake sugar or no sugar, you don't pay the tax. That assumes that tax is a barrier to people buying these things. Now, when people are wanting a dopamine hit, it's a drug addict approach almost. Sometimes the fact that the cost has gone up doesn't put people off. So that prediction is based on, right, my theory is if the price goes up, people will have less, and because they'll have less, there'll be an impact on health. And there's so many, all data are variables, and some of those bits of data, some of those variables are independent. They just exist. But some are dependent on others, right? I guarantee you that if I went out and ate junk food for the rest of my life, it wouldn't be very long. That's true for a generic population, everybody statistically, but it's also kind of true to Howard because it affects the majority of people. There are very few people who've lived a long and happy lifetime on nothing but junk food, the kind of supersize me approach. It's still not guaranteed, like you find the old person at 110, I've only ever eaten and smoked every day of my life and drank like a fish, and I'm still healthy. There's always an outlier on any bell curve, but statistically, chances are you're right. That's when you've got variables that they are dependent, i.e., if I change that variable 1, will it change variable 2? That's a good model, but finding out which dependence a variable is as hard a task. It's kind of the prep work for predictive analysis in the same way of choosing the right type of data. How are they interconnected? Sorry.
Can I just interrupt you? Sorry, because I think this is... So I think another thing that we could touch on, if you're happy to talk about it, is like behavioural profiling and murders. You've worked with murder for a long time. You've caught many murderers and other serial offenders. Am I right in saying I don't think behavioural profiling has ever helped you in your career? Am I right in saying that? Or do you have a take on behavioural profiling? Because I think I know what it is, but I think they help for people to hear it.
Oh boy, yes, I do. Like many things come along as the latest new hot technique, behavioural profiling came along. Now, I have to say, as a scientist, as an investigator, I'm open to any new method that helps me to put it in my box of tools. So I have had instances where that additional information has helped an investigation. But the problem was, like many things, and we've talked about this before, there was a time when behavioural profiling was viewed as the secret sauce. This is the guarantee of success. So instead of being a contributor, it was the magic wand. So other methodologies that are tried and tested suddenly were devalued, incorrectly so, even science, DNA, things like that. And my experience was that the people who practiced it, some of them were empire builders who relied on this new methodology being their secret to academic or career success. That's a pretty bad factor to use to drive a homicide or any kind of investigation. And you'd get a situation where they never had all the data. They weren't thinking like investigators. They couldn't access all the information because they weren't part of the same culture and regime. They were outsiders as academics. But they would come in and they would bang the table. I can tell you that your murderer's 6'3". He walks with a limp. He wears yellow corduroy trousers. He supports Manchester United football team and picks his nose on a Wednesday. Whether right or wrong, 9 out of 10 of those factors may not be relevant as to why he committed the murder, which is the only thing I'm interested in. I don't need to know everything about the guy. I just need to know, did he commit the murder and why? It's the so what box. But the other thing was, it was so specific because they were looking to shock value. Look how accurate and important accuracy, confidence. Eventually, when a murderer's caught and it turns out they're a completely different race, colour, creed, size, shape, different habits, instead of saying, our methods were wrong, we used the wrong data or incomplete data to come to our conclusions, or the analytic process we went through to come to those conclusions is flawed, or a combination of all of those, they'd say, well, if we'd have been told X, Y, Z, we wouldn't have come to that conclusion. Well, telling me why you got it wrong after the fact isn't actually a very good indicator to have confidence in your methodology. And unfortunately, there were some bad practitioners who came to the fore in that, because the police are like, we'll take anything, come in, new ideas. If it's going to help me catch a murderer or a criminal, I'll take anything. I'm a thief.
But let me ask you at this point, though, because I think, going back to your plank analogy, I kind of see profiling as like almost they're walking in the other direction along the plank, right? In that usually the shout goes out for profiling when there's been multiple incidents. There are very few lines of inquiry, or the case is, there's close to a dead end, and we're at that kind of, not a panic mode, but kind of, we need to start doing unconventional things to get there.
Shake the box,
and then they land, and this is where I'll try to be generous to profiling. They've got a tough call, right? They may come in and say, right, I have these 5 events, I'll study these 5 events, and I'll look for patterns and trends, I'll come up with some assessments, and I'll give you your profile. But the criticism that I've heard over my career in law enforcement, granted it was a long time ago, was that the problem was, by the time the profile became full enough to use operationally, a lot of people were down already. So it's kind of, you can't deploy them at point 0, point 1 of murder 1. And I think that's the thing with the prediction side of it, is because they're in that spot, right? As are the investigators. The investigators are there with a blank piece of paper thinking it's a little bit like Jim said, I'm in the jungle trying to work out, Dr. Jim Wilson, when he was trying to track the diseases in the jungle. He's there thinking, right, okay, I've got species around me that haven't even been seen before by science, and I've got to try and work out where this disease is coming from. What's it like? Just out of curiosity, I think people might want to hear from you on this, because obviously you've been a senior investigating officer in murder inquiries and other serious inquiries, and I guess the question I'm asking is, for the jobs where you think this isn't going to be the last one, there's another one coming. Can you take us through what that's like? What's running through your mind about, like, okay, in terms of predictives about, okay, what are we, and I'm not asking for tradecraft, I'm not asking for anything operationally sensitive. I'm just saying, what's it like in that space where it's like you found body 1 or body 2 perhaps, because body 2 might indicate the pattern, and you think there's a body 3 coming. What kind of things are going through your mind?
It's a minefield, because what you've got to understand, you enter the sequence of events that is a homicide at any point of those sequence of events. You may enter it at the point where you find out that somebody's planning to kill somebody else. So there isn't actually a homicide yet, and you have to try and quality risk assess, is there going to be one? Who's the victim? Because Ideally, rather than investigate one after the fact and convict somebody of homicide, if I could save somebody dying, everybody's a winner, including society. So finding out where you are on the chain, that particular lifetime of that homicide is important. Second thing is, well, is this just one on its own? One person has decided to kill another person. They never intended to kill anybody before or after. They're not looking for other victims. Or is this somebody who, and again, this is where the behavioural psychology comes in, has gone through a lifetime of behaviour of escalating violence for whatever reason, or maybe an escalating medical condition that's affecting their behaviour, and it's coming out as violence or homicide, so that if I don't intervene, potentially there are more than one offences. One's already been committed, two are in the process of being committed, and the same person is also scouting victims for others in the future, but they haven't identified them yet. You've got all of that going on in your mind. Now, focus has got to be, because we've all got limited time and resources, you are doing this real time. It's not like a cold case where it's been and gone and you can spend all the time, well, you can't spend all the time and resources in the world, but the time you invest, the kind of slow thinking approach and the care is very different to a homicide happened 4 hours ago and the evidence is disappearing fast, the criminal's still out there, the media are all over you, senior managers are all over you, the public has an expectation, we need to get a grip of this quick. They are chalk and cheese ends of a bell curve of homicide investigation or any serious crime, particularly homicide. And in that situation, you're probably not going to focus on behavioural psychology straight out of the box. You've got other priorities. But at any one point, and I've done this as well as being a senior investigating officer, which is a particular professional qualification and role in UK policing. It has similarities around the world, but it means something in the UK. It's not just a phrase. There are also things called review officers. These are people who are trained to review major investigations and look for, even when they're going on, look for potential flaws and opportunities to improve. Lessons learned, or how can we improve it so that it has a greater chance of success? It's called the review process. All the time, as well as being the investigator, I'm a review officer. Human nature, I'm thinking, how does this impact on other cases? I might be investigating the homicide of Mark Lockwood, but and think, well, I haven't time to think of a behavioural psychologist right now. There are other priorities. We may never get to that, not least because of the time lag you talked about and the lack of accuracy in what they're likely to come up with. A witness or a piece of CCTV or a piece of forensic evidence or a confession, an interview. There's things that can really make a difference very quickly. Psychology doesn't. That's just how it is, and I'm not criticising it, it's a tool. But if I was sat as a head of crime or as some national review body looking at serial crimes or just generic homicides, where I'm trying to improve the investigative processes overall for a series of crimes or for many crimes that are individuals, not series, i.e. multiple committed by the same people, I may well involve a behavioural psychologist because they may see overarching patterns and trends that you wouldn't see in a single investigation because of your other priorities that are competing. So it's horses for courses. It's kind of like analysis where, if you think about us in law enforcement, if you've got an immediate tactical requirement where you need some kind of analysis, incomplete though it is, to inform decision-making very quickly because of events in the real world, it's not the same as a piece of strategic analysis where somebody's saying, what are the likely trends in crime or organised crime behaviour over the next 10 years in our area? Predictive analysis. So that's where I'd put behavioural science. I'm not against it. There are some tried and tested methods within it that are of value, but it's no more a secret sauce than anything else. It's just one of the tools in the toolbox of an SIO. And the reality is, like I talk about with my analyst hat on, whenever I'm thinking as an investigator, my day job, I'm also thinking from an analytic point of view or an information science point of view. When you're thinking as an investigator or as an SIO, you're thinking this job, history, current situation, future tense, other jobs, the profession as a whole, crime as a whole. You have to do. Homicide isn't always just homicide. There are often other crimes around it. A serial homicide or a person who commits serial homicides probably didn't start just with homicides. They may have started with minor incidents of violence. So you don't just look at previous homicides, you look at previous serious violence or violence against a particular group of people, particular methodology, Look at the Yorkshire Ripper. His methodology was to beat working girls to death with a hammer versus the crossbow cannibal who shot women with a crossbow. Two completely different methodologies. Does that make sense?
It does. No, and I wasn't asking you to, sorry, I wasn't trying to do a hit job on behavioural science.
I'm not either, but it's the some behavioural scientists themselves who've dug a hole for it for the wrong reasons. It's not the customers. I'm a client of behavioural science like I am of forensic science.
Yeah. I guess what I was trying to explore, and I think I did it in maybe a clumsy way, was in my career, there have been times, and you've been in this place, we've both been in this place thousands of times, where a crime occurs and you have certain lines of inquiry and then they all stop. And then you sat in the office and there are no more lines of inquiry, but there's still an expectation to try and predict, to try and detect or find out what happened, get a suspect, generate more lines of inquiry. And the police have this tension all the time about whether to go public, but that generates false leads or whether, all that type of stuff. And I think what I was trying to get at with prediction was, I mean, I'm restricted in what I can say, and I'm desperately trying to think of an example I can share. And the best one I've got is this one. Because there have been times in my career where I have literally got nothing else to go on. Absolutely nothing else to go on. And the best I can do is, well, I don't know anything about the offender. I know little bits about the crime. I need to kind of start speculating, and I have to kind of make predictions that are highly speculative, and I have to kind of test those to see if they come true, just to get a starting point. So, for instance, here's the example I can share, which is many years ago, when we were both involved at looking at industrial cannabis cultivation, I remember at the time there were lots of national interviews with senior police officers saying, and I'm going back to the early 2000s here, why is cannabis cultivation going through the roof? And the prevailing view among some very senior officers was, we're clearly exporting it as a country. The notion we were growing locally and it was pushing it back overseas. Many law enforcement people involved in drug trafficking will tell you that that kind of didn't make sense for a lot of reasons, because smuggling is hard and it's expensive, right? And to be honest, in some respects, if you can grow it somewhere and get it to mainland, if you can grow it in mainland Europe, the chances of, I'm not saying it's impossible, but the chances of a syndicate growing it here and getting it back into mainland Europe cheaper than the local European group seems to be quite small. So I had this hypothesis that said, well, look, okay, what's the counter hypothesis? The counter hypothesis, we're not exporting it. If we're not exporting it, we're consuming it. If we're consuming it, then we've got to be seeing something, some sort of signal that's out there that we're not picking up on. And at the time, it was the stronger variants of cannabis that were coming through. And I decided to look at medical data for the first time. It was the first time I actually left my law enforcement job and kind of looked in the medical pot of data. And sure enough, it turned out that psychiatric admissions were increasing due to cannabis use. There were other psychological metrics from healthcare that showed that people with problems relating to cannabis were drastically increasing. It was increasing across kids. So you had all these metrics that suddenly said, look, okay, we've had cannabis for a long time, but for some reason, these metrics are rising significantly. At the same time, this other kind of industrial cannabis cultivation trend occurred. Now, it's difficult. I can't necessarily, because we don't have film crews and we don't have knowledge of all the syndicates involved, we can't conclusively prove, but we have got a sufficient base there to make a bit of a shout. And the prediction then became, I don't think we are exporting it in the round. I think we're just consuming more of it than we think. Yes, we have the British Crime Survey telling us about drug use, but actually it's limited sometimes. It's a good it's the best survey that we have in terms of national collection for data, but for drug use specifically, there's limitations with the British Crime Survey. And yeah, so I guess bringing it all back to what you're saying about behavioural science and all the rest of it is that I think, and why is prediction hard, is because when you're on the far end of that plank and that plank is vibrating up and down quite far, sometimes you have to play about in that space and you have to try and find something to kind of get yourself back towards the ship. And it's tricky, right? It's difficult. And sometimes it's blind luck. But I guess what we can say is it's not a constant. It's not something, you can't say, some situations you can use predictions, some you can't, but it is always difficult.
The thing for me, and I don't disagree with what you're saying, something we've talked about before is, with all analysis, there's a risk, and we've always spoken, I certainly have, about you need to consider what are the contingencies. What if our analytic product results in decisions that turn out to be wrong? What's the likely consequence of being wrong? You can either have a success or a null result where it doesn't really affect anything, or you can be wrong. If you're wrong in a homicide investigation, to quote the mother of a victim, hell freezes over because you've left a suspect out who may kill somebody else. If you watch anything about the history of the Yorkshire Ripper inquiry, which went on and on as this series of offences were carrying on, very much in the public eye, those detectives were not incompetent or not committed, but every day they were getting up to trying to deal with not just the investigation, but loads of other information and other people who were becoming stakeholders like the media, getting in the way of the investigation. But they would be going to bed thinking, we haven't caught them yet. And that kind of pressure can lead to mistakes. And those mistakes are well documented. And it's not unique. I've reviewed many homicide investigations in this country and abroad. You will always find opportunities for improvements or critical points in the decision path where they took a wrong turn. And it's not always because they're lazy or stupid or deliberately bad. They are human and they are under certain pressures at the time that average people, if you're not in that situation, you wouldn't understand. But to come back to prediction, one of the things that always makes me smile is we predict into the future, the plank scenario, assuming nothing's going to change, and that's what a trend is. Now, if you think about the guy walking the plank, if it's a guy, you could say, well, of 100 guys walking the plank, and that even if they were all the same weight and walked with the same gait, the variation in the plank thickness or the wood meant that it broke and some fell off before others. The rolling of the ship on the sea affected the physics of the plank and the weight on it and when it broke. The wind. I love Formula One, and last week they were at Monza in Italy, and it's a high-speed track with lots of straights, so there's very little variation where you can make a difference in your driving or machine performance style by saving time in the corners. So the times were all very, very close. All the cars were very similar. And you'd see people go from first to 10th for a small fraction of time, a fraction of a second. And it'd be because there was a gust of wind, moved them 5 centimetres further that way, and it affected that whole lap. It's the same with the plank, and it's the same with predictive analysis. Even when you're trying to predict a linear future, the ideal one, statistics, mathematical models all tend to work on linear predictions. They work best on linear predictions because they're the least likely to fail. Nothing else changes, like the rock we've thrown into space. Chances are that's where it'll end up. If you look at linear regression, statistical regression, all those models are mathematical models on volume data that are hypothesized around this is a linear projection. It's not something that's going to move about. Yeah?
Can I just add some thoughts there, though? Because I think when we talk about probability versus prediction, I think we talk about like odds, don't we? And I think and I've often struggled with this in every role that involves prediction. Yes, a dice has 6 sides. Yes, the probability is 1 in 6. The problem with situations and complex stuff, the stuff that's far along the plank, is the dice is on the deck, right? The dice is really easy to predict. It's going to be between 1 and 6. However, you also know that it's an equal chance in theory. Obviously, it's mechanistic. It depends on aerodynamics and how you throw the dice. But in general,
there are no knowns.
Sure. The problem you have in real life with predictions that are meaningful is the first problem is you don't know the outcome space completely. So you don't know all the possible things that could have happened. And you can imagine a few, but that's a spectrum, right? So that's a broad spectrum. The second thing is you can't repeat the experiment. So like in Intel, we talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis or Pearl Harbor. Well, you can't run the Cuban Missile Crisis 10,000 times to see statistically what the distribution was, and that's the other problem is that we'd love to apply some hard numbers and some hard science to this, but we need a universe times how many, to reach our satisfaction, 100 times, 1,000 times.
Massive data sample.
Yeah, absolutely. But here's the kicker. The kicker, the other is in a police context, but also in broader context, the things you're trying to predict are actively trying to hide or obfuscate what they're doing, right?
Bang on. That's one of my key points I was coming up to make. All of this that we've talked about up to now presupposes that any changes in the future weren't planned or intentional. They just happened. There was a I don't know, a meteor hit the planet, or suddenly there was an incident where all mobile phones went down. Like, remember the millennium bug?
Yeah.
Which never happened, but that was a real prediction.
Sure.
Unlike most things in life, particularly in crime, but actually in a lot of things, war's the same, politics are the same, business is the same. Rather than events occurring by chance or at random or passively almost, players, stakeholders who want to undermine the accuracy or the confidence you have in your prediction will deliberately do something different. They're following the same models, but they deliberately do something different because that makes the prediction model that you've used irrelevant. And I'll give you a really good example. I love looking at terrorism as a form of influence because it's a business based on we're small, we're attacking a larger opponent. It's kind of the David and Goliath. So how can we be effective with our limited resources? It's all about this business model of bang for your buck, if you want to call it that. Go back to 9/11. Awful event. Terrorists fly planes into the Twin Towers and the Pentagon, and others failed. Think about the terrorist organisations behind that. One, you have to convince your actors that they're going to die, and it's, they've got to be prepared to. And I know we talk about that glibly with the military, I'll die for my country and all this business. But human nature is, I don't want to die. There's a survival that overtakes everything. So one, you've got to get over that hurdle and have confidence that your actors know, and knowing that they're going to die, will do it. And they have ways of doing that. Number two, you need the training and the resources. If you and I were going to fly a plane into a building, not only do you need to know about the building and the location and what kind of plane, there's a small thing of how do you learn to fly a plane if you've never flown a plane before? So there's a massive logistics operation and finance and training and communications to get to the points where your actors can actually go out and carry out the act. So it's a massive investment. And on this occasion, there are many that fail. It worked. They were successful in their terms. The planes hit the buildings and the world went mad over it. So as a business win for terrorism, it was massive, phenomenal. I'm not moralising on it. I'm looking at business. What was the next thing? Well, immediately, the whole world is sensitised to repeatability. Where else might they fly planes into? We'll have massive airport security. We'll limit planes flying. If planes fly off a different route, we'll have them intercepted by military jets with permission to shoot them down if needs be. Suddenly the whole system is sensitised to that method of terrorism, that method of crime. What do the criminals do? Well, we've had the big investment. We'll go a completely different way. If we fly more planes, that's another big cost in resources that are finite and limited, but they're expecting us. The target is now hardened in police terminology. What can we do that has, now that the community is sensitised to our actions, what can we do that has a big bang but costs less? And the next phase, if you remember, key government departments in the USA started receiving envelopes in the post, the normal post, with anthrax in. So all the security services are looking in the skies for more planes. Meanwhile, there's an envelope winging its way in the back of a mail delivery van to a building. To send an envelope full of anthrax, I would suggest through an existing system, the mail, is a lot more cost effective and it doesn't burn your actors. You're not flying a plane into a building where you're sure to die. You might get caught and shot putting the envelope in a mailbox, but risk versus reward, it had just the same impact because the victim who was already sensitised, they're now looking over the shoulders thinking, well, not only are we watching for planes, we now have to watch for these envelopes. And the third stage, once having sent the first 2 or 3 with anthrax in, people are now sensitised to looking for envelopes with white powder in. Doesn't need to be anthrax. It's about poking the stick to keep the terror, the fear going. So they send envelopes with baking soda or baby powder in. So they've gone from high cost, high reward to very low cost, repeatable at low cost, very low risk for the same impact on the victims, the terror. That's a brilliant business model. And all the time, the authorities are playing catch up. They were never looking ahead. They couldn't. I'm not decrying any of the services, security services. I was part of that globally. They were trying their best, but you have to act on the basis of historic information. How do you get out ahead of it? In an ideal world, do you sit people down and say, can I predict what they might do in the future? because they're looking for this de-escalation, we've gone out. It's like a business that will go out and undersell things in the market to get market share, and then they put the prices up. It's a business tactic. To explain that, so what I'm saying is law enforcement, in terms of predictive analysis, you need to understand what's going on in the heads of your opponents, the criminals, because if you can understand their thought processes, you have a better chance of predicting their future behaviour. And I'm not a great believer in past behaviour is a good predictor of future behaviour. There's a bit missing off the end, that is, except when it's not. It's like it's a cheap phrase, a cheap win for something that has very little value. It's true in an extent, but it's not true more often than not. If you don't change, you will die. The one constant should be change, and good criminals change their behaviour. And we should, as law enforcement in this case, or any business, change our behaviour. Good example of that, and I don't think we've discussed it before, coming back to crime and mapping. At what time I worked in an area, and I wasn't involved in it, I was actually doing another job. I was known as the guy who did analysis, because I'd do my day job as a police officer, and then once in a blue moon go off and teach analysis at headquarters. And people would come to me with analytic problems saying, have a look at this, would you, Howard? And I'd do it alongside my day job. And a particular area, at the time they were suffering car thefts. High-powered cars were being stolen in a particular geographic area, and they couldn't get their heads around it. They couldn't interject physically, because chasing a high-powered car being raced around the streets at high speed creates a risk to the public. So intervening in that way was no good. You needed to find a way of intervening before or after the crime was committed, when they're not racing around like idiots. It's kind of like Sun Tzu. You need to bring the battle into an area where you have power, not the area where they have power. So they brought me all the data. And like you talk about hotspots, I looked at all this data, crime reports, and there was no pattern in terms of time or type of car, make, model, anything like that, time of day, method of stealing. There was no pattern in where the cars were being disposed of. Often they were just burnt out. The criminals could have made a fortune selling these cars on the second-hand market as stolen cars. They were high-powered cars, but they'd ram them into a garage and steal 200 cigarettes. If they'd have sold the car, they'd have had a lifetime supply of cigarettes in those days. And when I kept looking at I'm looking for patterns with my abstract analytic head on. And I started looking at colour of cars. And I noticed that they'd steal a red one, and then sometimes another red one, but then a colour. And the sequence of colours was kind of, green, brown, blue, pink and black. And I thought, I'm no sportsman. I suddenly realised, well, that's the sequence of colours in a game of billiards or snooker. So that was my theory, that what these kids were doing, and they were young teenage men, was, yes, they were stealing cars, but the object of the exercise was kind of bragging rights. They were doing it playing snooker for points like you might play a computer game, only they were doing it with real cars. If that theory, so the next step is, right, well, if I'm correct and I've now got myself in the head of the criminal, and it could be any kind of crime, how does this help us to intervene? And the answer is in the colours. There are loads of red cars in the UK and in the area that these crimes are happening. Loads of brown, loads of green, loads of black, loads of white, loads of blue, not many pink cars. So what I did was I told the one, we looked at the national database to see how many people owned pink cars in the particular geographic area, and there weren't many. So those cars, when they were at home at night, would be the likely place that they'd be stolen from. So you've got a physical place to go look and put your interdictory resources. Secondly, when are they going to steal a pink one? Well, you play these ball games in a sequence. So you'd watch the theft of other cars, and when it came to the point where they stole a red and they'd done all the other colours and the next one had to be a pink, that's when you'd press the button. You wouldn't be watching these pink cars all the time. You only watched them when the criminals got to the point where they needed a pink. And that's what we did. I can remember, not me, they sat on 3 addresses, I think it was, in the whole area. And sure enough, the criminals turned up at one to steal the car, and they were able to arrest them. They hadn't stolen the car, so they weren't driving around being dangerous, but we'd got in the head of them and were able to use that predictive analysis. And the success was, A, knowing which data to collect, and B, understanding what it was that was driving their future behaviour. When it wouldn't have worked was if one of the criminals had got arrested or got into hospital or been killed on one of these high-speed drives, because that would have broken the pattern. But we were lucky. And that makes the point that no matter how lucky you are, an unforeseen event can always screw with any kind of predictive analysis. So I'd always say, look, whenever you predict, If you accept all analysis, you need to have it with a caution and a health warning. Predictive analysis, your health warning and cautionary qualifiers, your QA, to your customers needs to be exponentially greater. And it's just the same. That's a law enforcement example. But think about business. Companies use predictive analysis to figure out where the population centres are and places that traffic flows with a view to putting the next fast food restaurant or petrol station. The health service do it to think about where do we need to put the next hospital or fire station or police station or bus terminus, the logistics of life. In business, in the stock market is all about predicting the future of those stocks. There's even something called the futures market, where you bet on, for argument's sake, a particular raw material. It might be coal, it might be eggs, it might be pork, some kind of product that next year it's going to be more expensive to buy. The predictive analysis models used for that will look at, I don't know, if it's pork, is there a big disease coming? Or are there some kind of issues with food supplies for pork or legislation that's coming out that might result in an increase in demand or a lack of supply to meet the current demand? Is the next greatest meal going to be spare ribs? Because if so, the demand for pork might go up. And they predict that and you bet on it. But the thing is with that, all you're betting is money.
But they don't just predict, though. Sometimes that's the thing, is the money goes into the advertising and they try and create the self-fulfilling prophecy, right? But I think we're coming to the end of the pod. I think we need to come back to this and we need to talk more about confidence in predictions. I think we need to talk a bit more detail. But I'm going to wind things up there. Is there anything else you want to say on it before we draw it to a close?
Just to underline that issue about QA. Remember what we said at the start? Prediction is different to confidence in your product. The further you predict into the future, the more focused your prediction, the more likely it is that the plank will break for factors that you don't know. So when you get into predictive analysis, and your customers will force you into it, the decision makers, for your own professional credibility and personal credibility, you need to always put a government health warning, if you will, underneath it that's exponentially bigger than what you would do for a piece of normal analysis, because it's far more likely to be wrong than right. And in some of the areas that certain areas of predictive analysis work, it's not just losing a bit of money on the stock exchange, it's losing life or affecting people's lives. So think of the military, think of politics, think of health service, think of law and order. It could have a massive impact. The consequences of being wrong can be phenomenal.
Thank you very much, Howard. I think that is a good place to close it there. Just want to thank everybody for listening. Don't forget to get in contact with the show. We want to hear everything you think about the show. Visit thecollators.com and we'll see you on the next episode. All the best. Bye-bye.